The sheriff's deputy threw up twice before he reached the stock pond. Not from the bodies, though there were 13 of them scattered across 100 yards of alkali flat, but from what had been done to their equipment. Someone had dragged every tent, every sleeping bag, every cooler to the center of the dry basin and built a pyre. The nylon had melted into black taffy. Beneath it, warped aluminum frame poles spelled out letters big enough to read from the rim. Go home. The bodies themselves lay where they'd fallen, some behind boulders, some in the open, all facing the same direction. Away from the ranch gate 3 miles west, the deputy's radio crackled. His sergeant wanted a body count. He counted again. 13. All men. Ages 24 to 61, the licenses would later show. None of them armed. Their trucks sat untouched at the trailhead, covered in 6 days of dust. The Geiger counters were gone. So were the claim stakes. What remained were blast craters, spent rifle brass, and a surveyor's transit with its lens shot clean through. Someone had been very patient. Someone had been very sure. Uranium prices did something strange in the spring of 1986. They ticked up. Not much, $5 a pound, maybe $6, but enough to wake up the Denver speculators who'd slept through the 70s collapse. Enough to dust off old claims maps and squint at the public land surveys of western Colorado. The real prospectors, the ones who'd lived through the boom-bust cycle twice already, knew better. The government wasn't buying. The power companies had stockpiles. But every rising price line breeds its own believers. Craig Hendricks ran a small investment newsletter out of a Capitol Hill walk-up. Precious metals, mostly. Some mining stocks. He'd been tracking the Soviet nuclear buildup, reading the tea leaves of DOE reports. When the Chernobyl reactor melted down in April, he sent a fax to his subscriber list. Uranium was the play. Not the big producers, not the listed companies. The play was in the ground. Find unpatented federal land with good survey history, stake claims, flip the leases to major operators when the buying started. Basic frontier capitalism. 12 men bought in. They called themselves the Plateau Group. Dentists, insurance adjusters, a high school basketball coach from Littleton. Weekend rockhounds with just enough disposable income to feel adventurous. Hendricks pulled old Bureau of Land Management maps, mineral survey reports from the Cold War prospecting frenzy. He found a 50-square-mile plateau east of Delta that had shown promising radioactivity readings in 1952. The government had surveyed it, then walked away. No active mining claims, no visible infrastructure. The maps labeled it open range. The group chipped in $1,200 each. They bought surplus Geiger counters, rented 2 Chevy Suburbans, packed enough freeze-dried chili and Coors Light to last a week. The plan was simple. Hike the plateau in a grid pattern, place claims on the hottest zones, file the paperwork in Montrose, then wait for the buyout offers. They told their wives it was a hunting trip. They told each other they were pioneers. Nobody told them about the lease. The Bureau of Land Management's Denver office kept grazing permits in a filing system one analyst later called pre-Columbian. Paper forms, carbon copies, misfiled renewals. The Kincaid winter lease had been active since 1971. 50 square miles of high desert plateau, east slope watershed, 5 windmills, 2 stock ponds. The permit cost the family $97 a year. It granted exclusive grazing rights from October through April. During that window, the Kincaids ran 200 head of crossbred cattle on land most people couldn't find on a map. Federal land, legally. Kincaid land, practically. The distinction mattered. Lyle Kincaid inherited the ranch in 1979, the same year his father died of an aneurysm while replacing a section of fence. The old man had run cattle the traditional way. Summer in the high country, winter on the plateau, sell in the spring. Lyle kept the pattern but sharpened the math. He crossbred Herefords with Brangus, aiming for calves that could handle the desert cold and still grade choice at slaughter. He radio-tagged 40 head, tracking their movement across the plateau to map the best forage zones. When a neighboring rancher asked why he was spending money on electronic tags, Lyle said, "Because I need to know where every single animal is." He meant it. The plateau was marginal land. Sagebrush, rabbit brush, scattered juniper. Snowmelt fed the stock ponds for 3 months. After that, windmills pulled brackish water from the aquifer. A cow could walk 5 miles between decent grazing patches, but the isolation was the asset. No highways, no neighbors, no hunters wandering through with rifles in poor judgment. Lyle could leave the herd for days at a time, checking them with binoculars from the rim, and trust they'd be there. The land wasn't generous, but it was predictable, unless someone violated it. Lyle's younger brother, Owen, ran the day-to-day operations. Owen had done 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat engineer: mine detection, demolition, perimeter security. He came back in 1971 and never talked about it, but he kept the habits. He cached supplies at strategic points across the plateau: water barrels, fence tools, veterinary supplies. He marked trails with cairns visible only from certain angles. When asked why he bothered, given how empty the land was, Owen said, "Empty's a temporary condition." Their cousin, Dalton Kincaid, managed the equipment and maintenance. Dalton had worked construction in Grand Junction, then come home when the oil shale boom collapsed. He knew diesel engines, hydraulics, and how to weld in a headwind. He also knew how to read county land records. When the uranium prices started climbing, Dalton spent 3 afternoons in the Montrose courthouse, copying every claim filing within 50 miles of the plateau. He brought the stack home and spread it on the kitchen table. "We got incoming," he told Lyle. The family's position was simple. The lease was law. The cattle were property. Anyone crossing the plateau without permission was trespassing. Anyone disturbing the cattle was stealing. Anyone hammering stakes into the ground was claiming what belonged legally, morally, to the Kincaids. They'd worked that land for 15 years. They'd lost calves to cold snaps and predators. They'd spent money on improvements the BLM would never reimburse. Some Denver hustlers with Geiger counters didn't get to waltz in and pretend none of that mattered. They wouldn't stop them with lawyers. Lawyers cost money and took years. They'd stop them the way the plateau stopped most things, by being exactly what it was. Owen found the first one on October 9th, 1986. A yearling Brangus heifer, radio tag ID 472, lying in the open 200 yards from the northwest stock pond. No predator damage, no lightning strike. A bullet hole behind the shoulder. Clean entry, no exit. Small caliber. Owen knelt, checked the tag, pulled his walkie-talkie, and called Lyle. "We got a shooter." They found 2 more by dusk. Both yearlings, both tagged, both shot and left to rot. The kills were spaced a mile apart, like someone was making a point. Lyle stood over the 3rd carcass, watching the light fade over the rim, and said, "They're claiming the land." Who they were became clear 2 days later, when Lyle drove to the trailhead at dawn and found 2 Chevy Suburbans with Denver plates, camping gear piled in the back, empty Coors cans in the fire ring, a topographic map spread on the hood, marked with circles and arrows in red grease pencil. Lyle took the map. He also took a photograph of the vehicles with his Kodak, making sure the license plates showed. Back at the ranch, Dalton ran the plates through a friend at the DMV. The Suburbans were rentals, but the credit card name came back: Craig Hendricks. Dalton pulled the claim filings again. Hendricks had filed a notice of intent for prospecting activity on October 1st, right at the edge of the lease boundary. The filing mentioned a prospecting party of up to 15 individuals. It didn't mention the Kincaid lease. It didn't ask permission. Lyle called the Bureau of Land Management. The ranger he spoke to said the claims process was separate from the grazing permits. If the prospectors stayed on federal land, they were legal. Lyle asked about the shot cattle. The ranger suggested calling the sheriff. Lyle called the sheriff. The deputy who answered said they'd send someone when they could, but the plateau was outside easy patrol range, and unless Lyle had a suspect, it was hard to say what they'd do. He suggested fencing the area or moving the herd. Lyle hung up. That night, the 3 Kincaids sat at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and the topo map. Lyle traced the red circles. "They're following the old survey lines from the 50s. Government marked those zones for a reason." Owen tapped a spot near the dry stock pond. "They'll end up here. It's the highest reading on the old map. They'll want to stake it." Dalton looked at his cousins. "What do you want to do?" A reasonable question. Craig Hendricks stood at the trailhead on October 15th and breathed the cleanest air he'd smelled in 5 years. The plateau stretched east under a sky so blue it hurt, No billboards, no traffic hum, just wind and sage and the promise of something valuable buried beneath it all. He turned to the others, 12 men in new hiking boots and REI windbreakers, and delivered what he thought was an inspiring speech. This was frontier work. This was what America was built on. Find it, claim it, profit from it. Nobody got rich sitting in a cubicle. The men cheered, not loudly, but enough. They organized into 3 teams of 4, each with a Geiger counter, a GPS unit, a two-way radio, and enough claim stakes to mark a dozen sites. Hendricks had mapped a grid pattern based on the 1952 survey. Each team would cover a sector, radioing back coordinates whenever the counter ticked above background. At night, they'd compare readings and decide where to place the actual claims. It was methodical, professional. Hendricks felt good about it. The first day went smoothly. The counters found low-level radiation, normal for granite-heavy terrain. Nothing exciting, but nothing discouraging. The men camped near the windmill, boiled water for ramen, and joked about striking it rich. One of them, Gary Pelletier, a dentist from Boulder, noticed the dead calves. He mentioned it to Hendricks, who shrugged. Probably disease, probably coyotes. They were 100 miles from civilization. Weird things happened. The second day, they pushed farther east. The terrain got rougher, gullies, boulder fields, scrubbed dense enough to scratch their shins. The GPS units worked fine. The radios had line-of-sight issues, but nothing critical. Around noon, they found the cairns, stone piles, 3 or 4 rocks high, spaced every quarter mile. Hendricks thought they were old survey markers. He told the teams to follow them. They'd lead to the high-value zones. The cairns led east. On the third day, a man approached them. He appeared around 10:30 a.m., walking in from the west with an easy stride. He wore a denim jacket, a sweat-stained Stetson, and carried no visible weapon. He introduced himself as Dalton Kincaid. He said his family ran cattle on the plateau. He said he'd noticed the camping activity. Hendricks explained the prospecting, the claims, the legal right to access federal land. Dalton listened, nodded, and said, "You boys seen any cattle out here?" They hadn't. Not live ones, anyway. Dalton smiled. "They move around. If you see any, don't spook them. They're tagged and tracked." He gestured east. "You're headed toward the old survey grid, right? I can save you some time. The best readings are near the stock pond, about 6 miles that way. Follow the cairns. Can't miss it." Hendricks asked how he knew about the survey. Dalton said everyone local knew. The government had crawled all over this land in the 50s, left markers, test pits, even some old drill cores if you knew where to look. Hendricks asked if Dalton had ever thought about staking his own claims. Dalton laughed. "I'm a rancher. I know cows, not rocks. But good luck to you." He walked back west. The plateau group followed the cairns east. Nobody asked why a rancher would walk 6 miles just to chat. The cairns multiplied. By the 4th day, the men were finding them every 100 yards. Some were obvious, thigh-high stacks on ridges. Others were subtle, 3 flat stones arranged in an arrow. Hendricks praised the old surveyors. They knew their job. The GPS unit started acting strange on day 5. Nothing alarming, just drift. A team would mark a waypoint, then find it had shifted 50 yards when they checked again. One of the men, Kyle Dressler, the basketball coach, suggested magnetic interference. They were prospecting for uranium, after all. Radiation could throw off electronics. Hendricks agreed. They started double-checking coordinates manually, pacing distances, using old-fashioned compass bearings. It slowed them down. That was fine. They had time. The teams spread out. Radio contact got spotty. Sometimes a call would go through clear. Sometimes it was nothing but static. Hendricks decided each team should work independently until evening, then converge at camp to compare notes. It was efficient. It kept momentum. Owen Kincaid watched them through binoculars from a basalt outcrop 3 miles west. He'd been tracking their progress for 5 days. They were following the cairns exactly as planned. The GPS drift was working. Lyle had spent 2 nights placing surplus military signal jammers in weatherproof boxes at key points across the plateau. Low power, just enough to nudge the civilian units off axis. By the time the prospectors realized they were lost, they'd be exactly where the Kincaids wanted them. Owen keyed his walkie-talkie. "They're on schedule. Lyle's voice crackled back. Good. Let them get comfortable. That night, Hendricks gathered the teams. They were tired but optimistic. The Geiger counters had found a hot zone near what the GPS claimed was the stock pond. The readings were strong. Not bonanza level, but worth staking. They'd hike there tomorrow, place the claims, and start the filing process. Hendricks estimated they could have 10 claims in the ground by week's end. He raised a Coors. To the plateau group. The men drank. The stars wheeled overhead. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees. Nobody noticed the fresh tire tracks 100 yards north or the U8 sound of a diesel engine idling briefly before cutting out. Delta, Colorado, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business except when they didn't. Population 3,000, one grocery store, 2 gas stations, a diner that served breakfast until 2 p.m. When the plateau group stopped for supplies on October 14th, they were noticed. 13 out-of-towners, city accents, new gear. The cashier at the Safeway asked where they were headed. Hendricks said, East Plateau, prospecting. The cashier, a woman named Denise Kovar, nodded and didn't say another word. But after they left, she called her sister, who was married to a man who worked at the feed store, who knew the Kincaids bought diesel there twice a month. The sister mentioned it to her husband. The husband mentioned it to Dalton the next time he came in. Dalton asked what the city men looked like. The husband described them. Dalton paid for his diesel and left. At the sheriff's substation, Deputy Ed Navarro took a call on October 16th from a Montrose County rancher reporting possible trespassers near the eastern plateau. The rancher didn't give his name. He said there were vehicles at the trailhead, men with radio equipment, signs of campfires in a high fire risk zone. Navarro logged the call. He didn't drive out. The plateau was 40 minutes away. He had a domestic dispute to handle in town, then a drunken disorderly at the VFW. He figured he'd check the plateau over the weekend if nobody called again. Nobody called again. The Bureau of Land Management ranger, Tom Gillespie, had 30,000 acres of federal land to oversee, with a staff of 2 and a budget that barely covered gas. When Lyle Kincaid called about the shot calves, Gillespie noted it in his log and said he'd look into it. He didn't. He had a wildfire watch, a fence dispute, and a backlog of paperwork. He assumed the cattle had been shot by hunters. He assumed the rancher was overreacting. He assumed someone else would handle it. What would you do if you heard that 13 men were camped on disputed land and the family who claimed it had a history of resolving disputes without lawyers? At Millie's diner, the usual breakfast crowd discussed the strangers. Phyllis Torrance, who'd lived in Delta for 60 years, said she hoped they found what they were looking for. Her husband, Frank, said the Kincaids wouldn't like it. Phyllis said the Kincaids didn't own the land. Frank said ownership was more complicated than paperwork. Someone at the counter asked if anyone was going to warn the prospectors. Nobody answered. They ate their eggs, they paid their checks, they went about their day. Small towns have a silence that's louder than shouting. By October 20th, the plateau group was exhausted but exhilarated. They'd logged 90 miles of hiking. They'd mapped 14 potential claim sites. The best readings clustered near the coordinates Dalton Kincaid had mentioned, the dry stock pond. Hendricks decided they'd stake claims there on October 21st. 6 men would place the stakes and record the GPS coordinates. The other 7 would pack up the camp and prepare to head back to Denver. They'd file the claims by month's end. That evening, Hendricks tried to call his wife from the camp radio. He couldn't get a signal. He tried the satellite phone they'd rented as backup. Static. Kyle Dressler joked that the plateau was cursed. Hendricks laughed. They had battery-powered gear. They had maps. They had each other. What else did they need? Lyle Kincaid stood at the ranch checking the weather forecast. Clear skies, light wind, good visibility. He turned to Owen. Tomorrow. Owen nodded. He'd spent the afternoon placing charges, 14 sticks of dynamite, salvaged from a construction site demolition 10 years prior. He'd cached them in waterproof tubes at key points around the stock pond. He'd rigged them with remote detonators, simple radio triggers, the kind used for controlled avalanche blasting. He'd tested them twice. They worked. Dalton checked the rifles, 3 hunting rifles, .30-06 caliber, bolt action, accurate to 400 yards in good conditions. They were legal, registered, sighted in. Dalton had shot elk at 700 yards. 13 stationary targets in open terrain was not a technical challenge. The family didn't discuss alternatives. There were no alternatives. The prospectors had been warned, implicitly, by the shot calves, by the silence of the town, by the land itself. They'd ignored the warnings. They'd followed the cairns deeper into Kincaid territory. They'd claimed what wasn't theirs to claim. The plateau had rules. Break them, pay the price. Mesa County had a livestock theft problem in 1986. Rustlers would cross the Utah border, cut fences, load steers into trailers, and vanish. The sheriff's department was understaffed. They had 2 deputies for the entire Eastern District. They spent most of their time on domestic calls, DUIs, and the occasional bar fight. Cattle theft was low priority unless the rancher had political connections. The Kincaids didn't. Lyle's father had antagonized the county commissioners over grazing fees in the 70s. The grudge stuck. When Lyle called about the shot calves, the deputy who took the report filed it under animal nuisance. When Lyle called again about trespassers, the deputy said it was a BLM issue. When Lyle asked what that meant, the deputy said, "Call the feds." The feds had their own problems. The BLM's budget had been cut twice in 3 years. Ranger Tom Gillespie was supposed to monitor grazing compliance, prevent wildfire starts, and patrol for illegal dumping. He couldn't do all 3. He prioritized wildfire. October was peak risk season. He spent his days watching smoke plumes and checking campfire permits. He'd planned to visit the Kincaid lease in November. November was after the prospectors would have been gone. There was a legal avenue. Lyle could have filed a civil complaint. He could have sought an injunction. He could have hired a lawyer to argue that the prospectors were violating the grazing permit's exclusivity clause. That process took months. By then, the claims would have been filed. By then, the prospectors would have had legal standing. By then, the Kincaids would have lost. The bank holding the ranch mortgage was watching. Lyle was 3 months behind. The banker, a man named Everett Sims, had made it clear the ranch needed to show profit or the loan would be called. Losing the plateau lease meant losing winter grazing. That meant selling half the herd. That meant bankruptcy. Sims didn't say he wanted the Kincaids to fail, but he managed an estate portfolio that included ranch foreclosures. He had buyers lined up, bureaucracies, and banks, 2 forces that crush slowly. The sun rose at 6:53 a.m. The temperature was 41 degrees, wind from the southwest at 7 miles per hour. The plateau group woke at 7, boiled coffee, ate granola bars. They were in good spirits. Hendricks divided them into 2 teams. The staking crew, 6 men, would hike to the stock pond and mark the claims. The breakdown crew, 7 men, would start packing the camp. Hendricks estimated they'd be on the road by 5 p.m. Gary Pelletier asked if they should radio the BLM. Standard procedure was to notify the ranger before filing. Hendricks said they'd do it from town. No point waiting for government permission when they were legal. The men agreed. They shouldered their packs. They checked their GPS units. The coordinates pointed east-northeast, 3.2 miles, easy hiking. They set off at 8:15 a.m. Lyle, Owen, and Dalton left the ranch at 6 a.m. They drove a pickup to a fire road spur 2 miles west of the stock pond, then hiked the rest. They carried the rifles in soft cases. They carried binoculars. They carried water and jerky. They wore earth-tone clothing, browns and grays that blended with the basalt and sage. They reached the rim above the stock pond at 7:45 a.m. They lay flat on the rock, glassed the terrain, and waited. The prospectors arrived at 10:38 a.m. They walked in a loose group, talking, laughing, pausing to check their Geiger counters. The readings were strong. Hendricks called it, "This was the site." They unloaded their packs. They pulled out the claim stakes, metal posts with flags, each marked with the plateau group's filing number. They started hammering. Owen whispered, "They're spreading out." Lyle nodded. "Wait until they're all in the basin." The men worked efficiently. 2 measured distances with a tape measure, 4 hammered stakes. Hendricks moved between them, writing coordinates in a notebook. He was focused, professional. He didn't look at the rim. Why would he? There was nothing up there but rock. At 11:47 a.m., the last stake went in. The men gathered near the center of the dry pond. Hendricks held up his GPS unit and laughed. The coordinates matched the survey map perfectly. They were standing on the hottest zone the government had identified in 1952. One of the men, a man named Terry Holcomb, an insurance adjuster from Lakewood, took a photograph. Everyone was smiling. Hendricks said, "Gentlemen, we just became prospectors." That's when Gary Pelletier checked his GPS and said, "Wait." His unit showed they were standing at the wrong coordinates, off by a quarter mile. He checked again. The numbers didn't match. He showed Hendricks. Hendricks checked his own unit. Different numbers. He looked around. The other men were checking theirs. Every GPS showed different coordinates. Some were off by yards, some by miles. One showed they were in Utah. Hendricks said, "What the hell?" Kyle Dressler said, "We've been jammed." The first shot hit the ground 6 inches from Terry Holcomb's boot. The sound echoed across the basin. Sharp crack, then rumble. The men froze. Another shot. This one kicked dust 10 feet to the left. Hendricks yelled, "Get down!" The men scattered. Some ran for the boulders at the basin's edge. Some dropped flat. One, a man named Curtis Lang, ran the wrong direction toward the rim. A third shot caught him in the thigh. He went down hard. Gary Pelletier crawled behind a sagebrush clump. His GPS unit was still in his hand. The screen flickered. He tried to shut it off. It wouldn't respond. He looked at the basin around him. No cover, 50 yards to the nearest boulder. He glanced at Curtis, who was screaming, clutching his leg. Blood soaked his jeans. Gary made a decision. He ran. He made it 15 feet before a round snapped past his ear. From the rim, Dalton worked the bolt, ejected the brass, chambered another round. He wasn't aiming to kill. Not yet. Lyle had been clear. Heard them. Make them panic. Make them run where we want them. Dalton fired again, aiming low. The bullet hit rock, splintered shale across 2 men huddled behind a juniper. They broke cover, sprinting for the boulders on the basin's west side. Lyle tracked them through his scope. He let them run. They were heading for the rocks Owen had marked with orange chalk 3 days ago. The rocks where the charges were buried. Hendricks reached a boulder and pressed his back against it. His radio was clipped to his belt. He fumbled for it, keyed the mic, tried to call the breakdown crew at camp. Static. He tried again. Nothing. He looked at the radio's screen. The frequency display was scrambled. He threw it down and reached for his satellite phone. The screen showed searching for signal. It had been searching for 3 minutes. Terry Holcomb crouched behind a boulder 15 feet away. He had a compass. The compass needle spun slowly, never settling. He looked at Hendricks and said, "Everything's jammed. We're blind." Kyle Dressler, pressed against the same boulder, said, "Who's shooting at us?" Hendricks didn't answer because he knew. Curtis Lang was still screaming. The wound in his thigh was arterial. Blood pulsed between his fingers. He tried to drag himself behind cover, but the nearest rock was 30 yards away. He looked up at the rim. He saw movement. A man standing, raising a rifle. Curtis threw his hands up. "Please, I'm hurt!" The man fired. The round hit Curtis in the chest. He stopped moving. The other men saw it. They understood. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't an accident. Someone was hunting them. Owen shifted position, moving 20 yards east along the rim. He had a clear line on 3 men pinned behind a cluster of boulders. They were shouting to each other. One tried to make a run for higher ground. Owen led him, squeezed the trigger. The shot hit the man, Steve Kellerman, a software engineer from Aurora, in the shoulder. He spun, fell, rolled into a gully. Lyle kept his rifle trained on the main cluster. 6 men were still mobile. They'd grouped up behind the largest boulders on the basin's west side. Smart move. The rocks were big enough to provide cover, but they'd walked right into the trap. Lyle keyed his walkie-talkie. "Owen, ready?" "Ready." Lyle looked at Dalton. "Light them up." Dalton pulled a radio trigger from his jacket. Simple device, red button, no safety. He pressed it. The first charge detonated behind a boulder 30 yards from the men. The blast was sharp, flat, not the Hollywood fireball, just a crack, a pressure wave, and a cloud of dust and shrapnel. Rock fragments peppered the men. One, a man named Leon Voss, screamed and grabbed his face. Blood ran through his fingers. The second charge went off 10 seconds later, closer. This one lifted a boulder the size of a washing machine and rolled it 5 feet. It missed the men, but the message landed. Nowhere was safe. Hendricks pulled the others toward a depression in the basin floor. It wasn't much, a shallow wash maybe 2 feet deep, but it was all they had. They crawled fast. Dalton let them go. He waited until they were grouped, then triggered the third charge. This one was placed in the wash itself, buried under 18 inches of sand. The men were on top of it when it blew. The blast killed 3 instantly. Hendricks, Terry Holcomb, and a man named Rick Donovan. Their bodies were thrown back, broken. The others, Gary Pelletier, Kyle Dressler, and a man named Jeff Strand, were hit by debris. Gary caught shrapnel in his abdomen. Kyle's left arm was mangled. Jeff was blinded by dust and blood. The shooting stopped. The echoes rolled across the plateau and faded. The silence that followed was worse. Gary Pelletier lay on his back, staring at the sky. He could hear someone crying. He tried to sit up. The pain in his stomach was extraordinary. He looked down. His shirt was soaked red. He pressed his hand against the wound. Warm, wet, too much blood. He thought about his wife. He thought about his daughter. He thought about the claim stakes they'd hammered into the ground an hour ago. He died at 12:23 p.m. Kyle Dressler was still alive. His left arm hung useless, bone visible through torn flesh. He crawled toward a boulder, using his right arm to drag himself. He could hear someone else moving nearby. Jeff Strand, maybe, or Leon Voss. He called out. No answer. He kept crawling. From the rim, Lyle watched through binoculars. He counted bodies. He counted movement. Owen's voice crackled on the walkie-talkie. I've got 2 still mobile on the east side. Lyle scanned. He saw them. Steve Kellerman, the man Owen had shot in the shoulder, and another man, Paul Garrett, a schoolteacher from Thornton, were trying to climb out of the basin's north slope. It was steep, loose scree. They were slow. Lyle said, "Take them." Owen fired twice. Both men went down. Dalton was scanning the south approach where the prospectors had entered the basin. No movement. No one had tried to run back that way. He keyed his radio. How many? Lyle counted again. 13 bodies, some moving, most not. He said, 13. Owen said, what about the camp crew? Lyle had forgotten. 7 men were still at the base camp 3 miles west. They'd heard the gunfire. They'd heard the explosions. They were probably running for the trucks right now. Lyle checked his watch. 12:35 p.m. He did the math. If the camp crew left now, they'd reach the vehicles by 3 p.m. The vehicles were 15 miles from the nearest paved road. The Kincaids had a 4-hour head start. Lyle said, let them run. Owen said, what if they bring help? Lyle said, help's 3 hours away. By then, we'll be done. The brothers and their cousin climbed down from the rim and walked into the basin. They moved methodically, checking each body. Most were dead. Kyle Dressler was still breathing. Lyle stood over him. Kyle looked up, tried to speak. Lyle raised his rifle and fired once. Leon Voss was alive, curled around his ruined face. Dalton checked him, saw the extent of the injuries, and finished it. Owen found Jeff Strand behind a boulder, blinded, moaning. Owen put a round through his chest. When they were finished, they gathered the Geiger counters and smashed them. They pulled up the claim stakes and snapped them in half. They stacked the pieces by the ranch gate 3 miles west. They dragged every tent, every sleeping bag, every cooler to the center of the basin and set them on fire. The nylon melted into black taffy. They spelled out letters with the aluminum poles, go home. They left the bodies where they fell. They walked back to their truck, loaded the rifles, and drove to the ranch. They arrived at 2:45 p.m. They unloaded the gear, cleaned the rifles, and burned their clothes in the burn barrel. Lyle called the BLM and reported that he'd found evidence of illegal prospecting on his lease. He said there were vehicles at the trailhead and abandoned equipment near the stock pond. He said he was concerned about wildfire. Risk. The ranger said he'd check it out when he could. Lyle hung up and poured a cup of coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He didn't speak. Neither did Owen or Dalton. They'd done what needed doing. The plateau was theirs again. Outside, the wind picked up. The sky darkened. By evening, it was snowing. The breakdown crew reached the trucks at 4:17 p.m. They were panicked, incoherent. They told themselves the gunfire had been hunters. They told themselves the explosions had been thunder. But when they tried the radios, they got static. When they tried their cell phones, they got nothing. They loaded into the Suburbans and drove fast, kicking up dust, not stopping until they hit pavement. They reached Delta at 6:50 p.m. They went straight to the sheriff's substation. Deputy Ed Navarro was eating dinner when 7 men stumbled through the door, shouting about gunfire and explosions and missing friends. Navarro sat them down. He took statements. They gave conflicting accounts. Some said the shots came from the rim. Some said from the ground. They didn't know how many shooters. They didn't know who. They just knew 13 men were still out there. Navarro called for backup. He called the BLM. He called search and rescue. By 9 p.m., a convoy was assembled. 3 sheriff's deputies, 2 BLM rangers, a volunteer SAR team. They drove to the trailhead, reached it by midnight. The snow was falling hard by then. Visibility was 20 feet. They made the decision to wait until dawn. The snow fell all night, 6 inches. By morning, October 22nd, the plateau was white. The rescuers hiked in at first light. They followed the GPS coordinates the breakdown crew had provided. The coordinates were wrong, off by a quarter mile, but the rescuers found the cairns and followed those instead. They reached the basin at 10:15 a.m. The lead ranger saw the bodies first. He stopped, held up his hand, told everyone to stay back. He counted. 13. He radioed for the coroner. He radioed for the sheriff. He stood at the rim looking down at the melted camping gear, the broken stakes. The message spelled in aluminum. Go home. Deputy Navarro arrived an hour later. He walked the scene. He documented everything. He found spent rifle brass on the rim, 3 positions spaced 50 yards apart. He found blast craters consistent with high explosive charges. He found bullet wounds in the bodies, chest, head, thigh. He found no weapons among the dead. He found the smashed Geiger counters. He found the claim stakes, snapped and piled at the gate 3 miles west, the gate to the Kincaid ranch. Navarro stood there for a long time. October 22, 1986, was the day Mesa County's smallest cattle operation became its biggest unsolved murder case. The investigation lasted 6 months. The FBI joined after week 2. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation sent forensic teams. They recovered the rifle brass. They matched the caliber to common hunting rifles, thousands in circulation across Colorado. They analyzed the blast craters. They determined the charges were commercial-grade dynamite, also common, used in construction, mining, avalanche control, untraceable. They interviewed the Kincaids. Lyle said he'd been at the ranch all day on October 21st. Owen confirmed it. Dalton confirmed it. Their stories matched. The FBI searched the ranch. They found rifles, all legal, all registered. They test-fired them. The ballistics didn't match. The FBI searched the property for explosives. They found none. They checked alibi timelines. Everything held. They interviewed the townspeople. No one had seen the Kincaids that day. No one had seen trucks leaving the ranch. No one had heard explosions. The plateau was remote. Sound didn't carry. The snow had covered the tire tracks. The snow had buried the cairns. The breakdown crew testified about Dalton Kincaid's encounter on October 16th, how he'd directed them toward the stock pond, how he'd seemed helpful. The FBI questioned Dalton. He said he'd been trying to keep them out of dangerous terrain. He said he'd warned them about the cattle. He said he'd done what any rancher would do. The FBI asked why he hadn't warned them about the lease dispute. Dalton said there was no dispute. The lease was legal. The prospectors were trespassing. He'd assumed they'd leave on their own. The FBI found the shot calves. By then, they were carcasses. The bullets recovered from the remains were .22 caliber. Common, used for varmint hunting. The Kincaids didn't own a .22. The FBI couldn't prove who'd shot the cattle. The signal jammers were found in late March, after the snow melted. 6 units scattered across the plateau, military surplus, sold at hundreds of gun shows across the West, no serial numbers, no purchase records. The FBI tested them. They worked. They'd been placed precisely to disrupt GPS and radio signals in the basin. Someone with technical knowledge had placed them. Owen Kincaid had been a combat engineer. The FBI noted it. They couldn't prove it. The case went cold in April 1987. The Kincaids kept the ranch. The bank didn't call the loan. The BLM renewed the grazing permit. The cattle grazed the plateau every winter, just like before. Lyle ran the herd until 2003, when he had a stroke. Owen took over. Dalton handled the equipment until his death from lung cancer in 2009. The Plateau Group's families sued the federal government for negligence. The case settled out of court in 1991. The families received a payment described as compensation for failure to enforce lease compliance and provide adequate public safety oversight. The amount was undisclosed. The settlement included a clause forbidding the families from publicly discussing the case. Craig Hendricks's widow, Susan, moved to Oregon. She never spoke to the press. She never returned to Colorado. In Delta, in R, people still talk about it. Not often, not in front of strangers. But when a deer hunter asks about the Eastern Plateau, someone will mention the 13 men. Someone will say the land's cursed. Someone will say the Kincaids had every right. Someone will say the government failed. No one will say who pulled the trigger. No one will say where the bodies were when the first shot was fired. No one will say they saw anything. Small towns protect their own. The Eastern Plateau looks the same today as it did in 1986. Sagebrush, dust devils, cattle skulls bleaching in the sun. The Kincaid lease expired in 2015. No family member renewed it. The land reverted to full federal control. The BLM declared it open for recreational use, hiking, camping, prospecting. The uranium market collapsed in the 90s and never recovered. No one stakes claims there anymore. But the cairns are still there. Walk east from the trailhead and you'll find them. Stone piles, 3 or 4 rocks high, spaced every quarter mile. They lead to the dry stock pond where the ground is still scorched in places, where fragments of aluminum frame still poke through the dirt. Where, if you look close, you can find a melted zipper, a boot eyelet, a blackened tent stake. The stock pond sits empty. The windmill rusted through in 2012. The BLM removed it. The water table dropped. The basin is bone dry now, cracked alkali, nothing growing. But in certain light you can still see the blast craters. You can still see the message spelled in the dirt. In 2021, a geology student from Boulder hiked the plateau for a field project. She was mapping the uranium deposits the government had identified in 1952. She found the old survey markers, she found the coordinates. She set up her Geiger counter at the stock pond and took readings. The radiation was there, low level but present, enough to justify the original claims, enough to have made the Plateau Group rich. She filed her report with the university. She didn't mention the cairns. She didn't mention the melted camping gear. She didn't ask why no one had ever developed the site. She finished her project and left. She graduated, moved to Texas, and works for an oil company now. The cairns still lead east. The stock pond still sits empty. And on October 21st, if you stand at the rim and listen, people say you can hear echoes. 13 men went looking for treasure. They found a line they shouldn't have crossed. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.